India has always liked to call its foreign policy strategic autonomy. But recently, the meaning of that phrase is being tested like never before. Case in point, India and the Philippines held their first joint sail in August 2025, a move Beijing publicly protested. New Delhi has also been ramping up its defense ties with both the Philippines and Vietnam, shoring up Quad cooperation and rolling out new BrahMos missile systems in contested waters. The question now is whether India can expand its naval reach without alienating its oldest defense partner, Russia, and without provoking a militarized China. We'll explain how a single missile sail and a single patrol change Beijing's risk calculus and what that means for India's relationship with Moscow. Which brings us to the seas themselves, where India's fleet has gone from a background presence to a force China can no longer ignore. India's growing naval footprint. For many years, India's Navy had only a token role in the South China Sea. Its vessels crossed those waters occasionally, usually for courtesy visits or participation in low-profile drills. The message was more about signaling friendship than about displaying combat readiness. Responsibility for standing up to China fell mainly to its Southeast Asian neighbors, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, countries whose smaller budgets and lighter fleets meant they often found themselves outmatched by Beijing's Coast Guard flotillas and fortified island bases. In contrast, India kept its maritime strength focused on the Indian Ocean, a theater where geography naturally gave it the upper hand. Venturing eastward into a region Beijing saw as its own sphere was an ambition talked about often but acted on sparingly. That calculation began to shift in the past year. New Delhi has moved from making symbolic appearances to carrying out deployments that repeat, last longer, and involve real exercises with partners. Indian warships now join regional patrols, adding their hull numbers to multilateral formations from which they were once absent. In August 2025, for example, India took part in its first-ever joint sail with the Philippines, sending the destroyer INS Delhi, the corvette INS Kiltan, and the support ship INS Shakti alongside a Philippine vessel. Those kinds of visible bilateral operations were once extremely rare. Today, they are beginning to form a pattern. This increase does not yet make India's Navy a permanent fixture in the contested sea. Unlike the United States or China, New Delhi has not established the basing network that makes constant rotations possible. Instead, what India has created is a sustained pattern of recurring deployments, operationally significant, politically noticeable, but still constrained. The difference is important. While Beijing's People's Liberation Army Navy can keep forces stationed near the Spratlys year-round, India is signaling intent rather than establishing a full-time guard. Capacity, however, has grown quickly. India commissioned its indigenously built aircraft carrier, an unmistakable sign of ambition to expand blue water operations. Alongside it are the Project 15B destroyers, modern vessels armed with advanced radar suites and long-range cruise missiles. These ships are not only more capable than the older craft they replace, they also allow India to form task groups that can defend themselves at sea rather than relying on coastal protection. That expansion reaches to the Andaman and Nicobar Command as well. These island outposts, sitting much closer to the Strait of Malacca than the Indian mainland, have been reinforced to serve as valuable logistics hubs. From there, Indian ships can stage forward, refuel, and extend their reach into the wider Pacific with far greater efficiency than before. The deployment record reflects these upgrades. Indian frigates and destroyers have begun to appear along sailing routes near the Spratly and Paracel Islands, waters where China's activities and claims are most entrenched. This is not a matter of coincidence. By placing visible naval units in zones of Chinese assertiveness, New Delhi puts itself in the same operational environment where smaller Southeast Asian fleets have absorbed most of the pressure alone. When an Indian escort joins an exercise near Manila or shadows passage routes near Vietnam, the optics change. Beijing now faces a country that brings real naval mass into those waters. For regional capitals, that shift creates a mixed reaction. Manila and Hanoi in particular welcome the presence. The Philippines has repeatedly complained of Chinese harassment of its resupply missions, while Vietnam has spent decades in tense maritime standoffs. Having Indian ships alongside them reassures domestic audiences and broadens the balance at sea. Yet there is a flip side. Crowded waters combined with modern, heavily armed vessels raise the stakes of every close encounter. What might once have been a collision between two? Patrol craft could now involve advanced surface combatants, a scenario none of the smaller states wants to see escalate. It is in China where these deployments are felt most keenly. Beijing has spent more than a decade turning its artificial islands into mini-fortresses, brushing off international rulings that questioned its claims. Every Indian ensign that appears in those waters complicates China's picture of control. Is one thing to manage familiar challenges from U.S. naval patrols, is another to account for a rival that not only shares a disputed land border with China, but is also now active in contested maritime zones. This adds an additional player to Beijing's strategic equations and chips away at its claim of being the only major Asian power in the region. But can India keep ships on station long enough to truly alter Beijing's approach? This is the core problem of sustainability. Unlike the United States, India cannot call upon a global logistics chain of allied bases and refueling points. Every patrol requires complex planning for fuel, crew, maintenance, and resupply, especially as the distance from Mumbai or Chennai stretches across thousands of kilometers. The Andaman and Nicobar facilities help lessen the pressure, but they are not comparable to China's hardened island runways and hangars right on the South China Sea's doorstep. For now, India can maintain months-long deployments, but it still lacks the infrastructure for continuous, year-round presence. Nevertheless, the strategic effect arrives long before absolute parity is reached. Smaller neighbors now have a partner close enough to shift the local balance. Where once Beijing could rely on confronting Manila or Hanoi one-on-one, it must now consider that New Delhi can enter the picture directly. That added uncertainty strengthens the bargaining position of every Southeast Asian capital. For India, this is leveraged not only in the maritime domain, but also in diplomatic conversations across Asia and beyond. So far, India's approach has been measured rather than reckless. It is demonstrating that it can appear regularly, operate alongside others, and contribute credible assets to the wider regional equation. Even without replicating the plan's permanence, the fact that an Indian destroyer might round the Spratlys or berth at Da Nang shapes decision-making in Beijing. At the same time, it elevates India in the eyes of Southeast Asian states they're searching for dependable partners. That recognition is a gain in its own right, setting India apart from being seen as merely a distant observer. The unanswered question is how these new patterns intertwine with India's choice of partners. Building genuine relevance in the South China Sea requires more than showing up. It requires forging ties that carry military, political, and symbolic weight with those most affected. And here, India has made deliberate decisions that point to a new kind of alignment, one centered on two familiar but strategically sensitive names. Why the Philippines and Vietnam matter to India. India's decision to deepen defense partnerships with the Philippines and Vietnam was not random. It was carefully calculated. Both countries sit on the front line of disputes with Beijing, and each brings a different kind of value to New Delhi's long-term strategy in the South China Sea. In recent years, India has moved beyond symbolic gestures by formalizing structured ties, elevating relations with Manila into a strategic partnership in August 2025, joined by the first joint sail inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone from August 1st to 4th, and expanding cooperation with Hanoi through energy, maritime, and logistics agreements that build on years of steady engagement. These moves are consistent with India's growing determination to shift from observer to participant. For Manila, the logic is immediate. Its small, overstretched navy faces persistent harassment from China around hotspots such as Scarborough Shoal and the Second Thomas Shoal. Philippine vessels are routinely shadowed or rammed by Chinese ships, leaving local forces unable to push back effectively on their own. While the United States remains the Philippines' treaty ally, its enforcement of those commitments has ebbed and flowed depending on Washington's internal politics. By aligning with India, Manila adds another layer of support. Rather than replacing the U.S. role, India offers advanced weaponry, joint exercises, and political recognition, parallel measures that supplement American guarantees and make it more difficult for Beijing to isolate any single partner. Hanoi, by contrast, is defined less by external appeals and more by history. From a 1979 border conflict to repeated maritime standoffs over oil and fisheries, Vietnam has resisted Chinese pressure directly for decades. That record resonates in New Delhi, where policymakers see parallels in their own clashes with China along the Himalayas. Shared experience of conflict with a stronger neighbor has fostered a natural sympathy and trust between the two governments. By deepening naval cooperation with Vietnam, including regular port calls in Da Nang and logistics access agreements, India strengthens ties with a partner that will not shy away from confrontation if pushed. these relationships are not built on promises of permanent Indian deployments in contested waters. Instead, they revolve around cooperation through port access, reciprocal visits, defense technology transfers, coordinated drills, and shared training programs. For the Philippines, the most concrete symbol of this cooperation is the arrival of BrahMos cruise missile systems. India has exported shore-based BrahMos batteries under a $375 million contract announced earlier, with deliveries beginning in April 2024 and continuing into 2025. By mid-2025, at least 2 batteries had been transferred, immediately boosting Manila's coastal defenses. For the first time, the Philippines possesses a supersonic missile capable of credibly deterring large vessels near disputed shoals. Every shipment also represents India marking its presence in the region without stationing personnel long-term. In Vietnam's case, the progress has been less about individual weapon systems and more about frameworks. India and Vietnam now conduct joint naval exercises on a regular schedule, allowing Indian frigates and destroyers to practice maneuvers alongside Vietnamese patrol craft. Training programs have widened too, with Vietnamese officers enrolling in Indian naval academies and Indian personnel rotating through Hanoi-based exchanges. What emerges is an ecosystem of habits that gradually integrate the two militaries, personal relationships, and operational familiarity that extend further than signed agreements. Hanoi, in turn, provides New Delhi with critical advantages: intelligence sharing on Chinese deployments, the possibility of future port access, and a partner whose political calculus is openly skeptical of Beijing's intentions. These cooperative steps have already played out in exercises. Near the Philippines, simulations have rehearsed Indian warships coordinating with local patrol boats to secure shipping lanes through areas shadowed by Chinese vessels. Near Vietnam, drills have included anti-submarine warfare scenarios and coastal defense maneuvers, reflecting Vietnam's concern over Chinese undersea activity just off its shores. Far from symbolic, these activities demonstrate operational linkages that China cannot dismiss as routine port calls. For Beijing, the optics are unmistakable. The South China Sea is not just another maritime theater, it is central to China's grand strategy, trade routes, and regional power projection. The presence of BrahMos missile batteries in the Philippines introduces a real anti-ship capability into contested waters, one supplied by a rival along China's land border. Meanwhile, India appearing in exercises along Vietnam's coastline reminds Beijing that its neighbors are not isolated but increasingly tied to outside players with the capacity to complicate Chinese calculations. The practical effect is an expanded set of unknowns for Chinese commanders, who must now account for Indian-supplied weapons and operational partnerships alongside U.S. and local forces. For India, the benefit lies in transforming rhetoric about partnership into a visible role in regional security. Historically, its attention gravitated westward toward Pakistan and northward toward its land frontier with China, while the Eastern Maritime Front was treated as secondary. Expanding engagement with Manila and Hanoi signals a shift. New Delhi has placed stakes directly into the South China Sea, through partnerships, through material assets, and through repeated operational presence. Whereas in the past India could issue diplomatic statements in ASEAN discussions while remaining distant, it now shoulders more direct responsibility. Its credibility rests not just on words, but on capabilities embedded in the region. Choosing to focus on the Philippines and Vietnam also underscores India's willingness to step into more demanding partnerships. Less confrontational options existed. Thailand and Malaysia, both balancing between Beijing and Washington, could have provided India with easier relationships without the same exposure to tension. Yet officials in New Delhi judged that demonstrating relevance in the Indo-Pacific required operating with those most exposed to China's maritime assertiveness. By proving its capacity to play a meaningful role in the toughest environments, India shows regional states and extra-regional powers alike that it can make substantive contributions beyond symbolism. This comes with real risks. If Philippine outposts come under renewed blockade or if Vietnamese vessels clash at sea again, India's support will face a test. Supplying hardware and engaging in exercises helps strengthen deterrence, but when push comes to shove, Manila and Hanoi may expect India to respond in ways that New Delhi may find difficult. That uncertainty is part and parcel of being an invested partner. Aligning so closely with both capitals reinforces India's new position not as a distant observer, but as a security stakeholder. For Southeast Asian states wary of Chinese power, India's presence brings assurance. For Beijing, It is evidence that the chessboard is becoming more complicated, with rivals multiplying where once the field felt more predictable. And for India itself, the partnerships with the Philippines and Vietnam rank among the clearest signals, yet that it is ready to anchor itself further east, taking on risks to gain influence. What ties these developments together is not only naval cooperation or political rhetoric, but also the introduction of concrete capabilities into contested zones. Among them, one system stands out for both its symbolism and its operational impact, an Indian-built supersonic missile now deployed at one of the most volatile maritime flashpoints on Earth. BrahMos in contested waters. A new factor now sits on the literal shoreline of the South China Sea, the BrahMos coastal defense batteries supplied by India to the Philippines. These are not symbolic patrol boats or diplomatic texts. They are supersonic cruise missiles under the direct control of the Philippine Marine Corps, positioned to target high-value warships in waters where disputes have often been fought with fishing vessels and Coast Guard cutters. At supersonic speed, BrahMos cuts down reaction times and forces navies to account for the very real risk of sudden, high-end strike capability. Even a handful of launchers alters the way Chinese commanders calculate risk before sending ships into contested zones. What makes the BrahMos tactically significant is its design. It flies at roughly Mach 2.8 to 3, several times faster than most subsonic cruise missiles. The export variants supplied to Manila carry a range of around 290 kilometers to stay within international agreements, but India itself has developed extended-range versions capable of striking targets at several hundred kilometers. In fact, New Delhi cleared procurement of BrahMos Yar regiments in 2024, reflecting its intent to expand the weapon's reach. The speed, range, and versatility of these missiles mean that vessels operating in the West Philippine Sea now face the possibility of being tracked and engaged from land long before they can respond. Getting these systems into place was a complex undertaking. BrahMos is not simply a missile. It is a system that includes wheeled launchers, command and control vehicles, radars, and maintenance units. In 2025, deliveries to the Philippines required multiple transport flights and extended technical assistance. Indian advisors worked closely with local forces to integrate the system into coastal defenses. Philippine units trained for months under Indian guidance, practicing deployment from mobile launch trucks designed to shift positions quickly, avoiding the vulnerability of fixed batteries. Road and base upgrades near Palawan and Luzon were required to support such mobility, enabling dispersal and concealment until the system is activated. Manila's goal was clear: not to present a static target for China, but to keep enough unpredictability that Beijing must assume the weapons could appear suddenly wherever they are most effective. For India, this cooperation has been as much about political presence as about exporting hardware. Indian personnel embedded in the project serve not just as trainers, but as representatives of New Delhi's stake in the region. Uniformed advisors at Philippine bases send an unmistakable message that India is not only selling equipment, but shaping how it is fielded. Through BrahMos, New Delhi signals that it supports Manila's resistance to expansive Chinese claims and that deterrence in the South China Sea is no longer a U.S.-led monopoly. From Beijing's perspective, the implications are obvious. Until now, China's maritime strategy in the West Philippine Sea has balanced mainly against the Philippines' small navy and coast guard and the shifting reliability of U.S. presence. An Indian-supplied missile system creates a new layer of deterrence that China cannot simply wait out. These missiles are not tied to U.S. politics or deployments. They are Philippine-owned and will remain in local hands regardless of external changes. For China, that means a recurring obstacle that complicates plans to intimidate or blockade Filipino forces near Scarborough Shoal or Second Thomas Shoal. Vietnam has also shown strong interest in BrahMos. While Hanoi has not yet received deliveries, its military relationship with India is growing, and officials have openly signaled their desire for the system. If Vietnamese coastal units were eventually equipped, covering approaches near the Spratly or Paracel Islands, China's southern flank would be encircled by multiple pockets of Indian-backed missile coverage. Even if each battery is limited in number, the distributed presence would multiply the risk to Chinese task groups. In maritime conflict, perception often matters as much as capability. The knowledge that any patrol could come within range of supersonic land-based missiles forces adversaries to move more cautiously, undermining their sense of dominance. Measured against the scale of China's People's Liberation Army Navy, the Philippines and Vietnam remain negligible in conventional strength. China fields more destroyers, frigates, submarines, and carriers than all its Southeast Asian neighbors combined. Yet naval balance is more than tonnage. A single successful strike against a destroyer or amphibious ship could equate to billions in losses and a profound political shock. The BRAMOS represents this latent threat, small in numbers, large in consequence. Beijing knows that the risk of high-profile damage, even from one launch, cannot be discounted, and this changes how it must plan operations in disputed waters. For Manila, the system delivers something it has never possessed before, a credible deterrent that extends well beyond its coastline. The Philippines may still lack a blue-water navy, but now holds the ability to threaten larger adversaries within its EEZ. This is not permanent balance against China, but it increases deterrent options that were absent only a year ago. The hope for Manila is not to win a naval showdown, but to create enough risk to compel Beijing to think twice before escalating. India's calculus is equally careful. Supplying BRAMOS demonstrates credibility as a security provider without overcommitting. Unlike the United States, New Delhi is not anchoring permanent forces in the region. Instead, it exports a capability that Southeast Asian states can maintain themselves while retaining influence through training, sustainment, and upgrades. This builds durable relationships without tying India down to permanent basing agreements. The symbolism of commitment combines with practical, long-term leverage. Within ASEAN, the deployment has created both reassurance and unease. Some states see it as a positive step, showing that external powers other than the U.S. are willing to help them resist Chinese coercion. Others worry that the introduction of supersonic missiles raises the danger of incidents escalating faster than before. Even without launches, the presence of advanced weapons in fragile waters makes any encounter more charged. Inside the bloc, the BRAMOS is therefore not just a Philippine asset, but also a regional signal that security dynamics are shifting. For China, the presence of BRAMOS means that maritime operations once considered routine now carry higher stakes. Supply lines to its artificial islands in the Spratlys could theoretically be targeted. Patrols near disputed reefs must assume new risks. The weapons mobility means China cannot know where batteries are hidden, adding uncertainty to every deployment. The result is neither outright deterrence nor dramatic rebalancing, but a raised strategic cost that narrows Beijing's options. Ultimately, the system delivers different payoffs to each of its stakeholders. For Manila, it is a deterrent against harassment. For India, it confirms a new role as a regional defense partner with influence inside the South China Sea. For Beijing, it is a fresh layer of complications that cannot be wished away. And for Southeast Asia as a whole, it shifts the calculations of both risk and opportunity in dealing with the region's largest power. The missiles themselves are unlikely to ever be used unless diplomacy collapses. Yet their presence already changes patrol routes, negotiation strategies, and naval exercises. They embody defense cooperation and deterrence in a way few other measures could. That is the subtle but lasting weight of Indian-made weapons in contested waters. But while New Delhi sharpens military partnerships and introduces hard assets to China's doorstep, another dimension of strategy looms large. Weapons may guard maritime claims, yet trade routes and markets still underpin India's economic strength. And navigating those ties is its own kind of battlefield, the one defined not by missiles, but by dependence and competition. The trade triangle, India, China, and the U.S.-India's wider strategic picture, is shaped not only by weapons and deployments, but also by the flows of trade that bind it to the very powers it seeks to balance. This is where the so-called trade triangle between India, China, and the United States defines the limits of New Delhi's freedom of action. The contradiction is clear. India and China maintain extensive bilateral trade, making Beijing one of New Delhi's largest overall partners, even as Indian ships and missiles appear in waters China claims. India imports vast quantities of electronics, solar equipment, industrial machinery, and chemicals essential for pharmaceutical production. Exports to China, by comparison, remain narrow, largely raw materials such as iron, ore, and agricultural goods. The pattern leaves India dependent on critical Chinese inputs for its high-growth industries, despite rising political and military friction. In parallel, the United States stands as India's most important export market. American demand absorbs software, outsourced IT services, pharmaceuticals, and expanding categories of manufactured goods. Each relationship offers opportunities, but together they present a structural problem. Military deterrence rests on a foundation the economy alone cannot secure. In blunt terms, India seeks deterrence at sea but still needs imports, from semiconductors to chemicals, that originate in or pass through China. The reliance on U.S. markets brings its own complications. India has benefited from billions in service exports, sustaining entire sectors of employment in Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and other hubs of software engineering. Yet policy volatility in Washington creates regular disruptions. In recent years, U.S. tariff disputes resurfaced, with steel, digital services, and certain manufactured goods all facing threatened or actual levies. These measures often fluctuated with America's election cycles, producing an atmosphere of uncertainty. For New Delhi, this means a basic vulnerability. Even as the U.S. anchors a growing defense partnership, commercial access can tighten or loosen depending on domestic American politics. Tariff pressure in 2024 and the continuing threat of new restrictions in 2025 show why India remains cautious about leaning too heavily on any one market. Against China, the dynamic is inverted. India absorbs more imports than it sends back, translating to a persistent trade deficit. But the imports remain too important to cut, especially in electronics, solar technology, and active pharmaceutical ingredients that drive India's global competitiveness. Even during military standoffs in Ladakh or naval confrontations near the Spratly Islands, container traffic between Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Indian ports has continued largely uninterrupted. This economic interdependence does not erase hostility, but it constrains choices by raising the cost of escalation. China knows restrictions on these exports would hit Indian industry directly. India knows blocking trade would harm its own growth as much as China's. Both sides therefore manage an uneasy parallel track where confrontation on one front coexists with dependence on another. Strategic autonomy has been New Delhi's preferred description of this posture. In practice, it functions less as a grand principle and more as a necessity. India cannot afford exclusion from American markets, nor can it endure sudden disruptions in Chinese supplies. So policymakers adjust constantly. When U.S. tariffs narrowly miss Indian goods, India leans closer to Washington with assurances of cooperation. When tensions spike at the border with China, New Delhi looks toward Japan or ASEAN to thicken security ties. When either partner applies pressure, India reminds the other of its alternatives. The result is not equilibrium, but constant recalibration, an effort to reduce exposure without eliminating the underlying dependence. The exercise extends beyond elites into public debate. Popular anger at China has grown sharply since the 2020 border clashes, leading to boycotts and demands for economic disengagement. Simultaneously, frustration with American visa rules or tariff measures occasionally undermines the appeal of closer alignment with Washington. The government threads these sentiments into its messaging, presenting strategic autonomy as both pragmatic and nationalistic. Programs like Make in India or the push for semiconductor fabrication in Gujarat form part of this narrative, but progress is slow. Domestic chip capacity will take years to mature. Cutting out Chinese solar imports requires subsidies and complex retooling. Until such plans bear fruit, dependence on external suppliers remains a fixed constraint. One of the sharpest paradoxes emerges around defense production itself. Forward deployments into the South China Sea consume advanced materials and complex subsystems, many sourced through global supply chains that ultimately trace back to China. Even the commissioning of India's new indigenous carrier involved imported inputs from Asian markets linked to Chinese supply networks. Modern destroyers and missile systems likewise rely on electronic and metallurgical components not yet produced at scale inside India. Thus, the very Navy that signals defiance in disputed waters also reflects the limits of strategic independence, built in part with parts from across the border. The United States adds further complexity, is simultaneously New Delhi's largest customer and its most unpredictable partner. The export volumes provide jobs and hard currency that underpin India's growth targets, but tariff threats dangle over those flows with little warning. Washington's political cycles dictate when confrontations erupt over issues like digital taxation or carbon-related duties. Aid and cooperation might be announced in one sector even as restrictions appear in another. For India, this translates into opportunity paired with uncertainty. Europe, Japan, and the Gulf may help diversify markets, but none match the scale America represents. The trade triangle, therefore, holds a consistent structure. Chinese supply chains feeding Indian growth, American demand monetizing that growth, and Indian diplomacy attempting to steer between them. Neither axis is easily replaced, and both carry leverage that can be used at moments of tension. Beijing can tighten inspections or raise costs of essential goods. Washington can alter tariffs or tighten visa quotas. For Indian policymakers, the aim is not to escape this triangle, but to prevent either side from applying sufficient pressure to force strategic concessions. Autonomy here means room for maneuver, even if the parameters remain set by larger powers. Public presentation of this balancing act emphasizes resilience. Government messaging highlights successful diversification moves, new energy agreements with the Gulf, courtship of European technology firms, or collaboration with Japan on infrastructure projects. Yet underneath, the most decisive relationships remain triangular. The risks are amplified by the fact that India is pursuing simultaneous defense modernization, requiring uninterrupted growth and investment. Any shock to trade with China or the U.S. jeopardizes the budget allocations that underpin naval expansion, missile procurement, and new industrial projects. Economic interdependence, therefore, forms an invisible ceiling. India can confront, but only within the space permitted by uninterrupted supply and market access. The consequence is visible on every deployment. Each destroyer sailing through contested seas carries both military weight and underlying exposure. Confrontation with China cannot fully sever trade. Embrace of the U.S. cannot fully erase market volatility. Strategic autonomy has become less about choosing paths than about managing risk in a structure that is unlikely to change soon. The paradox remains. India's push to assert itself militarily rests on dependencies that bind it to its rivals and partners alike. Economic interdependence does not dictate outcomes, but ensures every bold move carries the shadow of potential retaliation. And while the triangular trade balance sets firm boundaries, India's external relationships extend well beyond China and the United States. Another legacy partner continues to loom large, especially across the defense sector. For decades, one country supplied the majority of India's most advanced weapons and technology, shaping the very foundations of New Delhi's military power. That long-standing source of support is now facing its own crisis, and India finds itself questioning just how much it can still rely on that connection. Russia, India's old ally, new dilemma. For decades, Russia has been central to India's defense structure, providing both the volume and variety of advanced weaponry that few other partners were willing to supply. From Sukhoi fighter aircraft to frontline battle tanks and high-end missile systems such as the S-400, Moscow played the role of dependable supplier when Western governments hesitated. That trust was built during the Cold War when India wanted to preserve distance from the United States while still modernizing its armed forces. Over time, a habit of cooperation grew. Joint exercises, shared officer training, and an entire defense vocabulary based on Russian platforms. Today, much of the Indian Air Force and Army still relies on Russian designs. Yet that inheritance now comes with tension rather than reassurance because Russia's situation on the global stage has changed significantly. Moscow's decision to launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 set in motion a chain of sanctions from Europe, the United States, and their partners. Restrictions on banking access, technology imports, and maritime insurance reshaped Russia's ability to trade and to deliver sophisticated defense components abroad. These measures remain in force 3 years later. To cope, Russia has leaned heavily on countries willing to keep business flowing. China emerged as its largest outlet, but India too continued to purchase Russian crude oil at discounted prices and to keep defense contracts alive. That dual track created political friction for New Delhi, maintaining vital economic and military supply lines to Moscow, while facing increasing scrutiny from Western governments determined to cut Russia off. India's reliance on Russian oil has been particularly visible. Cargoes of crude shipped from Russian ports were rerouted into Indian refineries, where they were processed and then exported in refined form to global markets. For India's economy, this was a critical stabilizer, keeping energy costs manageable at a time of global inflation. For Western partners, however, it looked like circumvention. India leveraging Russian isolation to profit even while building closer partnerships with the United States and Europe. Each delivery gained headlines abroad, sparking questions about whether India's commitments to new allies were undermined by its unwillingness to abandon the old. The defense pipeline reflects an even sharper dilemma. Indian military planners depend on a constant flow of spare parts to keep existing Russian equipment ready for combat. Tanks, jet engines, helicopters, and missile systems remain tied to Russian inventories. In recent years, sanctions and supply disruptions have meant that shipments did not always arrive on schedule, delaying routine maintenance. Reports of slowdowns in collaborative projects underscore the challenge. Several long-term ventures between India and Russia, once seen as milestones of strategic cooperation, began slipping behind schedule due to the difficulty of sourcing electronics and advanced components restricted by sanctions. For Indian officers who face constant pressure to sustain readiness, these delays were not notional. They grounded aircraft, restricted armored unit deployments, and placed strain on air defense networks. At the same time, India has made visible efforts to diversify away from this dependence. French Rafale fighters now fly regular sorties from Indian bases. American transport planes and maritime aircraft handle strategic lift and surveillance. Israeli UAVs and missile systems fill critical operational gaps. Each new contract shifts the balance slightly away from Russia, reducing exposure to single supplier risk. But diversification does not happen overnight. The cost of Western gear is higher, deliveries take time, and integration requires training and adaptation. For Moscow, the optics of this shift are unmistakable. Where it once saw India as firmly anchored in its defense orbit, it now sees a partner edging toward arrangements with countries Russia openly defines as adversaries. This has political consequences. Russian officials and state media often frame India's diversification as opportunism, cooperating when it suits, stepping back when Western partners offer better deals. In New Delhi, the calculation is more pragmatic. With Russian supplies under strain and Chinese assertiveness intensifying, India cannot rely solely on a source that itself is aligning closer with Beijing. Indeed, Russia's deepening partnership with China complicates India's logic for staying aligned with Moscow. At official levels, Moscow presents its ties with Beijing as a strategic necessity to offset Western hostility. For India, however, it means that one of its oldest suppliers is also strengthening bonds with its main adversary, forcing uncomfortable questions about whether that relationship still serves its national interest. The result is visible in everyday planning cycles. Spare parts from Russian vendors remain essential, but new tenders increasingly go to Western companies. Officers who once trained entirely on Russian systems must now adapt to doctrines shaped by NATO standard equipment. Maintenance crews juggle two sets of platforms with different standards, while policymakers defend oil imports from Russia against Western criticism. In effect, India is sustaining two parallel tracks at once, keeping legacy systems alive with Russian cooperation while attempting to secure its future with Western technology. Neither track runs smoothly on its own, and together they risk leaving India caught between two dissatisfied partners. Energy transactions produce similar friction. Indian ministries defend the decision to keep buying Russian crude as economic necessity, pointing to the way refiners use discounted imports to keep domestic fuel prices more stable. Yet such gains come at diplomatic cost. Every barrel links India to a country under heavy sanction, and every tanker leaving an Indian port with re-exported fuel reinforces the impression that New Delhi is softening the edge of Western pressure. That perception is not easy to reconcile with India's growing efforts to work more closely with Washington, Paris, and Tokyo on regional security. Russia's own capacity challenges magnify these difficulties. Cut off from many Western technologies, Moscow has turned to whatever partners remain willing to deal. China is now its primary source of manufacturing inputs. For India, this has knock-on effects. Russian commitments on defense projects sometimes stretch years beyond their targets, creating uncertainty over whether promised deliveries will ever arrive in working order. Even established contracts face delays as sanctions complicate financing and insurance arrangements. The sense of reliability that once gave India confidence in Russian supplies has been replaced by doubts at every stage. The strategic picture is therefore one of awkward balance. India continues to buy discounted oil and depend on Russian defense spares because replacing them instantly is impossible. At the same time, it invests in French, Israeli, and U.S. systems, hoping to widen its options. This awkward diversification satisfies no one completely. Russia senses drift, the West sees hesitation, and India itself manages only partial relief from dependence. The defense posture that once looked like long-established cooperation now looks more like constant improvisation. Such compromises bleed into wider geopolitics. When India deepens engagement with the Quad or attends maritime drills with the U.S. and Japan, Moscow notices. When India holds military exchanges with Russia to keep spare parts flowing, Washington notices. each step reverberates across multiple capitals. The Cold War-era clarity of India being firmly tied to Moscow no longer exists. What New Delhi maintains instead is a more fragile arrangement in which neither camp is fully reassured. That fragility is exactly where risk lies. If supplies are interrupted, if oil purchases trigger more pointed pressure from the West, or if Russia's coordination with China tightens further, India must reconsider its footing yet again. The consequence is not just technical, it is strategic credibility. Defense modernization plans require steady flows of spare parts and financing. Energy security requires sustainable imports. Yet the overlapping pressures of sanctions, Western scrutiny, and Russia's own reliance on China strain every element of this arrangement. New Delhi finds itself managing, not resolving, the relationship. For decades, alignment with Moscow was central to Indian strategic comfort. Now it is an ongoing source of uncertainty. This steady erosion of certainty prepares the ground for the larger question shaping New Delhi's foreign policy today. How far can India still claim strategic autonomy while navigating multiple sources of dependency at once? Strategic autonomy tested. Strategic autonomy is facing its hardest test yet. For decades, it functioned as India's guiding principle, rooted in the idea that the nation could decide its path without being bound by the rivalries of others. Historically, that meant avoiding formal alliances while keeping open lines to both East and West, working with the Soviet Union on defense, trading with the United States as markets opened, and eventually doing business with China even as disputes simmered. This doctrine offered India breathing space in a divided world, enough independence to avoid being a client state, and enough flexibility to draw benefits wherever they were found. But the landscape of the 2020s looks less forgiving. Major powers are consolidating into rival blocs, the global economy is tightening under political pressure, and the maneuvering room New Delhi once relied on has narrowed sharply. The pressures cutting into this autonomy are not abstract, they are immediate and specific. From the United States, the trigger has been recurring tariff pressure. Indian steel, pharmaceuticals, and IT services all rely heavily on American demand, which makes sudden tariff announcements a powerful lever in Washington's hands. Even as Indian ships join U.S. vessels in Indo-Pacific patrols and the Malabar exercises grow in scale, exporters back home worry about new protectionist measures appearing without warning. This puts India in a contradiction. The country deepens security coordination with Washington, but at the same time braces for economic shocks from the very partner it leans toward militarily. Across the northern frontier, China poses the second force reshaping autonomy. Border deployments remain tense years after clashes in Galwan Valley, with both militaries continuing to reinforce positions in high-altitude terrain. At sea, Chinese presence stretches from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean, where survey ships and submarines now appear on a more regular basis. New Delhi has responded by reinforcing its forward naval presence, including joint patrols with Southeast Asian partners and missile sales to the Philippines. Yet beneath these moves lies dependence. Indian industries still import vast amounts of electronics, machinery, and pharmaceutical inputs from Chinese suppliers. Autonomy, in this sense, is reactive. India positions ships and missiles to counter Beijing's moves, but it cannot disengage without harming its own economy. The third pressure point comes from Russia. Sanctions have disrupted defense deliveries, leaving Indian armored and air units waiting for spares. Collaborative projects such as jet fighters and missile systems are slowed by Moscow's growing reliance on Chinese technology. At the same time, discounted Russian oil shipments keep India's refineries running and household fuel prices stable. The outcome is a financial and political bind. Reducing purchases risks economic pain, but continuing them risks alienating Western partners who expect tougher stances on Moscow. In each case, Washington's trade tools, Beijing's assertiveness, Moscow's volatility, the assumptions that once let India stand apart are being eroded. New Delhi's response has been to stretch the doctrine of autonomy to its maximum limits. Instead of formally joining a bloc, India participates in both. It attends Quad meetings alongside the United States, Japan, and Australia, coordinating on maritime surveillance and logistics exercises. At the same time, it maintains a seat in BRICS, where Russian and Chinese delegates sit across the table discussing financial alternatives to the Western-led system. It signs defense agreements with Washington and Paris while still accepting deliveries from Moscow, even if delayed. It provides BrahMos missiles to the Philippines as a counter to China, while continuing to meet Chinese delegations in trilateral economic forums. The rationale is consistent. Never place all bets on one camp, never burn every bridge with another. Diversification runs beyond weapons purchases. French Rafales operate alongside Russian Su-30s. Israeli drones supplement Indian reconnaissance capabilities even as Russian trainers continue joint drills. U.S. maritime aircraft provide ocean surveillance that no regional partner can match, but Russian oil tankers still anchor at Indian ports delivering discounted crude. To outsiders, this looks messy, sometimes hesitation, sometimes contradiction, but it is deliberate. Strategic autonomy has morphed into careful balance management, where every gain on one side is offset by at least partial continuity on the other. The challenge is perception. Washington grows impatient with India's reluctance to formalize commitments. Moscow sees diversification as drift. Even Southeast Asian states, pleased with India's growing presence, question how far New Delhi would go if open conflict erupted. For India, however, the calculation remains plain. A binding alliance risks escalation it cannot control. Abandoning Russia outright would create immediate energy and military shortages. Severing Chinese trade would damage key industries. What India does instead is walk the edge of each option, accepting costs, limiting exposure, and trying to keep maximum room for maneuver. This strategy does not project the confident independence of earlier decades. It projects survival in a harsher environment. Yet it still buys India one of the rarest commodities in geopolitics: time. Time to diversify suppliers further, to grow its economy, and to build enough military credibility to ensure its choices are not dictated by others. For now, it holds, but the cost of maintaining that stance with sharper great power rivalry is climbing fast. Watch closely for two triggers in particular: a sudden wave of new U.S. tariffs or a major Chinese escalation at sea. Either could force India to make decisions that erode its middle path more clearly than any summit speech. And as this balancing act stretches forward, one grouping in particular has come to symbolize the opportunities and risks that accompany India's choices. Originally dismissed as symbolic, it has become a platform where India's role is now increasingly central. Japan, Australia, and the expanding Quad. When India's engagement with the Quad began in the late 2010s, it was careful, almost hesitant, a platform framed in polite diplomatic dialogue rather than hard security commitments. By 2025, that posture looks very different. The group is evolving from primarily diplomatic dialogue into more practical interoperability and coordination, and India now places itself alongside Japan, Australia, and the United States in exercises that test how their forces might operate together in a real contingency. For a country that had spent years keeping the grouping at arm's length, the shift is significant. The reasons are partly about China's growing assertiveness, but they are also about access to tools India cannot develop quickly enough on its own. The best example of this evolution came during the Malabar exercises in mid-2025. Originally a bilateral set of drills between India and the United States, Malabar has expanded into a multi-layered naval operation involving all 4 Quad members. The latest version featured India's INS Vikrant sailing with Japan's Izumo-class carrier, Australian frigates conducting coordinated anti-submarine warfare maneuvers, and American destroyers integrating with both. The drills simulated convoy protection, coordinated submarine tracking, and complex replenishment operations. What mattered most was the evident willingness of the participants to share command structures. For India, which historically preferred to run operations in parallel to avoid dependence on another's command node, this was a notable change. It meant New Delhi was finally prepared to test what interoperability would look like in a scenario beyond the scripted stage of port calls and ceremonial gun salutes. Tokyo's influence has been instrumental in bringing India along that path. Over the past 2 years, Japan has extended steady offers of technological support and intelligence sharing, welcoming Indian officers into discussions about maritime domain awareness and surveillance. Facing its own challenges with Chinese patrols around the Senkaku Islands and farther afield in the East China Sea, Japan has a direct stake in helping India become a counterweight further south. The link is straightforward. If Indian patrols in the South China Sea stretch Chinese resources, Tokyo gains more leeway in its own contested waters. Cooperation has produced measurable results. Indian planners now benefit from Japanese surveillance drones, radars tuned for submarine detection, and coastal monitoring systems that extend India's vision well beyond its own waters. These exchanges are practical, not symbolic. They provide India with what it has often lacked: the situational awareness and technical backbone that make distant deployments credible rather than fragile. Australia, too, has found an expanded role in the framework. Its geography makes it an obvious partner for sustaining Indian vessels that operate far from home. Darwin and Fremantle, once occasional stopovers, have become routine points of access for Indian ships requiring fuel and minor maintenance. Regular visits reduce India's dependence on its Andaman and Nicobar bases as a sole jumping-off point. Canberra's own security anxieties overlap with India's. Both face Chinese assertiveness in areas critical to their interests: Australia in the Pacific Islands, India in the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. Logistical support from the Australian side tightens the loop, transforming what might otherwise be sporadic Indian appearances into a capacity for sustained deployments. For New Delhi, that logistical integration is invaluable since it addresses the fundamental challenge any rising naval power faces: staying on station long enough to matter. Washington remains the anchor of this group, but the balance within it is more nuanced than in the past. The United States provides platforms, intelligence networks, and basing options no other partner can match. Yet India's expanding presence in contested waters has changed the dynamic. By demonstrating it can contribute BrahMos deployments in the Philippines, months-long naval patrols in the South China Sea, and credible presence in multilateral exercises, India has positioned itself not as a follower, but as a partner whose independent moves reinforce the group's weight. For years, one of the quiet frustrations in Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra was doubt about whether India would commit operationally when it mattered. Now, with evidence of concrete deployments, that skepticism has softened. The core value of these changes lies in the operational nuts and bolts, not only in the symbolism. A Japanese patrol aircraft can pass live acoustic data about submarine tracks in the East China Sea to an Indian frigate operating hundreds of miles away. Australian bases shorten India's supply chain, letting it rotate ships back into contested waters with far less downtime. American satellites and command. Networks link with Indian sensors and weapon systems, allowing for better real-time interoperability. For military professionals, this is where rhetoric turns into practical capability. The value to India is access to satellite and maritime domain awareness, training interoperability, and logistics interoperability, practical tools that matter when ships operate far from home. This progression inevitably bleeds into wider geopolitics. For Russia, India's new level of integration with the Quad sends an unwelcome signal. Already unsettled by Indian diversification toward French, American, and Israeli equipment, Moscow now sees its longtime partner experimenting with coordinated drills alongside Western militaries that Russia routinely criticizes. While Russian arms, sales, and oil still provide a cushion against a clean break, the perception in Moscow is that India is drifting. For China, the discomfort is even sharper. Beijing has long dismissed the Quad as an irrelevant arrangement for talking, but its propaganda line is harder to sustain as joint drills become increasingly complex. Watching an Indian carrier fly training sorties under a command umbrella shared with Japanese and Australian escorts highlights a coordination Beijing cannot ignore. India's calculation has adjusted in lockstep. Concerns that joining too eagerly might restrict strategic autonomy have given way to a recognition that participation brings leverage in its own right. As long as India avoids treaty commitments, it preserves room to maneuver while gaining the benefits of regular coordination. Access to technology, intelligence, and logistical channels aligns with India's immediate needs. For New Delhi, the functional gains outweigh the reputational worry of edging closer to an alliance system. By taking part without signing binding defense pacts, India plays both sides of the line, showcasing strength to China and reassurance to partners, while still holding its traditional non-aligned branding. The difference from only a decade ago is stark. Exercises once limited to simple sailing maneuvers now feature complex anti-submarine hunts, carrier operations, and coordinated logistics on open seas. For Beijing, the message is clear. India is no longer an uncertain participant, but a force contributor to collective deterrence. For smaller Southeast Asian states, it demonstrates that India operates not only bilaterally with Vietnam or the Philippines, but also within a wider structure that multiplies its impact. To Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra, it confirms India can help shoulder regional responsibility. The Quad is not an alliance treaty, but it is building the tools of one: interoperability and supply lines, without India signing binding defense pacts. What remains uncertain, however, is how the states outside the Quad interpret this acceleration. Regional perception varies, and support is not universal. Some governments see India's new posture as necessary balance. Others view the sudden visibility of BRAMOS and Indian carriers as a source of tension that raises the risk of escalation. Their reactions tell us just how difficult it is to align diverse interests in a crowded maritime arena. ASEAN reactions. How do Southeast Asian governments actually perceive India's decision to expand its military profile in the South China Sea? The answer is not uniform because ASEAN is less a cohesive bloc than a diverse collection of states with different strategic calculations. Some see India's presence as a much-needed counterweight, others consider it a potential source of escalation, and many hover between the two. What stands out today is that New Delhi's new assertiveness has compelled ASEAN capitals to show their preferences more sharply than before, exposing differences that had previously been blurred under the cover of collective statements. The Philippines has emerged as the most enthusiastic supporter. Manila upgraded its ties with New Delhi into a strategic partnership in August 2025, following years of frustration with Chinese pressure around Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal. India's first joint naval sail with the Philippine Navy inside the country's exclusive economic zone in the same month carried weight far beyond symbolism. For Manila, this was practical reassurance that China is no longer the only major power operating in its contested waters. The delivery of BrahMos coastal defense systems reinforces that shift, giving the Philippines for the first time a high-end strike capability supplied by a rising Asian partner. Filipino leaders present this collaboration to their domestic audience as proof that the nation is no longer alone, while abroad they highlight it as evidence that external support for Philippine sovereignty goes beyond their long-standing U.S. alliance. Public messaging has been particularly sharp in reminding Beijing that its coercion now faces multiple deterrent layers, not all of them tied to Washington. Vietnam also welcomes the Indian presence, but with a more measured calculation. Hanoi upgraded relations with New Delhi in 2025 through frameworks that outline cooperation in maritime security, energy exploration, and defense logistics. Yet the Vietnamese approach reflects its tradition of balancing external powers without binding itself tightly to any one. For Hanoi, India represents solidarity with another Asian state that has its own history of conflict with China, but practical expectations remain grounded. Vietnamese officials point out that defense cooperation agreements are not substitutes for mutual defense treaties. They broaden options, but they do not guarantee intervention. This cautious stance means Vietnamese naval port calls for Indian ships, joint exercises near Da Nang, and officer exchanges are all welcomed, but they are described domestically as one part of a wider web that includes Japan, Russia, and even limited outreach to the United States. The symbolism is strong, but Vietnam frames it carefully to manage risk. By contrast, Indonesia and Malaysia represent the more cautious side of ASEAN opinion. Jakarta has consistently positioned itself as a neutral facilitator within Southeast Asia, preferring diplomacy and ASEAN-centric institutions over external military involvement. In this context, Indian deployments raise uneasy questions. Indonesian officials have publicly supported freedom of navigation, but expressed concern privately that the introduction of outside powers' missile systems to the region risks feeding escalation cycles. Media commentary has reflected worry that India's arming of the Philippines may encourage a more militarized regional contest, undermining ASEAN's attempts to craft a cooperative security narrative. For Malaysia, those apprehensions go even further. Kuala Lumpur maintains a generally quiet approach with Beijing, often handling disputes without high-profile confrontation. Against this backdrop, New Delhi's missile sales and naval presence appear to Malaysian policymakers as destabilizing additions. They see the danger that Beijing may respond with stronger shows of force not only against India's direct partners, but also against regional trade and transit routes. To them, India's assertiveness risks shrinking ASEAN's role by pulling the spotlight toward major power rivalry. Beyond these key players, the reactions across ASEAN fall into more ambiguous territory. Singapore remains pragmatic, often emphasizing the importance of keeping all trade routes open and secure. From Singapore's standpoint, any external contribution to protecting passage is welcome, but it stops short of endorsing stronger confrontational postures that might force open alignment choices. Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos are even more reserved. Their close economic ties with Beijing, combined with domestic political priorities, limit their appetite for visible engagement with India. The result is a spectrum: open enthusiasm in Manila, measured support in Hanoi, unease in Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur, and neutrality or muted responses elsewhere. This spread of attitudes complicates ASEAN's collective diplomacy. The association has long valued its central role in regional security initiatives, often relying on consensus to issue statements on maritime disputes. But the arrival of India as a growing player makes it harder to find common wording. Manila now pushes for language endorsing external defense partnerships. Malaysia prefers emphasis on negotiations and diplomacy, avoiding references that validate outside military actors. The compromise language that emerges from ASEAN summits often reads cautious and general, emphasizing stability and peace while omitting specifics. India's assertiveness has amplified the gap between deterrence seekers and status quo managers, leaving ASEAN statements thinner and less decisive. The shared dilemma, however, unites even the divided positions. Most Southeast Asian governments want to avoid one-sided Chinese dominance, but they also fear a great power collision playing out in their waters. India's naval presence sits uncomfortably in this middle ground. It signals deterrence, complicates Beijing's ambitions, and reassures vulnerable states like the Philippines. Yet it simultaneously raises questions across the region about whether India's involvement might intensify Chinese assertiveness and increase militarization. ASEAN states therefore tend to emphasize ambiguity and risk management. They want the insurance of external power involvement, but without triggering open bloc formation. India's partnership helps create options, yet it also adds to the complexity they must manage. From an operational standpoint, military planners in the region interpret India's activities in practical terms. A visiting Indian destroyer or a missile sale does not instantly alter the balance of naval power, but does adjust the calculus of daily patrols, potential escalations, and crisis diplomacy. Each presence changes how Chinese vessels approach Philippine resupply missions or how Vietnamese patrols contest areas near the Paracels. For states like Indonesia and Malaysia, the concern is less about immediate power ratios and more about crisis dynamics. A region that once relied chiefly on Coast Guard standoffs now has supersonic cruise missiles in play. That shift makes escalation ladders steeper, raising the diplomatic stakes for every incident. In this environment, India's role is recognized but not yet fully trusted. Southeast Asian leaders see it as a welcome balancer, adding weight to regional resistance efforts, but they also recognize its limitations. India's partnerships remain young. Its ability to sustain operations far from its own shores remains uncertain, and its long-term commitment has yet to be tested in a real maritime crisis. What ASEAN observes today is a power in transition, strong enough to alter choices in contested waters, not yet established enough to be relied on as a stable presence year after year. The reactions therefore amount to guarded acceptance. The Philippines hails Indian involvement as essential. Vietnam integrates it carefully into a diversified posture. Indonesia and Malaysia voice unease and caution. The rest of ASEAN weighs the benefits of deterrence against the risks of entanglement. The phrase that encapsulates the consensus is balance, enough outside presence to hold China in check, but not so much that the region becomes an arena for uncontrolled rivalry. India's visible rise as a regional player may strengthen deterrence, but also forces ASEAN states to navigate even more carefully within an already tense maritime setting. For India, the lesson is that recognition in Southeast Asia is not the same as trust. Its military steps win headlines, naval visits create reassurance, and missile sales demonstrate capability. But ASEAN governments continue to measure carefully how this involvement intersects with their desire for strategic ambiguity and avoidance of escalation. In short, India is accepted as part of the South China Sea equation, but seldom embraced without qualification. That balance sets clear boundaries on how far India's external ambitions can go. And while regional reactions shape the diplomatic environment abroad, an equally decisive set of constraints emerges much closer to home, where the resources for sustained power projection must weigh against the needs and pressures of India's own population. India's domestic pressures. India's outward push into contested waters tells one story. But the pressure shaping how far such moves can be sustained begins at home, where economic realities and political expectations create limits no fleet expansion can ignore. These domestic pressures sit beneath every headline of a destroyer sailing east or a missile battery moving offshore, quietly defining what is possible and what risks becoming unsustainable. Foreign policy debates often play out with talk of alliances and deployments, but inside India the calculus is more straightforward. How much can the country realistically spend on projecting strength abroad while trying to deliver stability to more than 1 billion citizens? Pride in new visibility abroad is real, but the trade-offs run deep. Defense is one of the government's highest priorities, and India spends heavily to maintain and upgrade its military. Yet this comes against a backdrop of economic strain, slower growth than once anticipated, inflationary pressure on households, and widening demands for social investment at home. Leaders in New Delhi defend higher defense spending as essential, but the tension it creates runs straight through every budget cycle. The logic itself is simple. Expanded naval ambitions require expanded resources. Maintaining a carrier group or forward surveillance network is not a symbolic gesture, but a recurring cost that eats into the broader fiscal space. When the Ministry of Defense approved procurement of more than 220 extended-range BrahMos missiles in 2024, it provided a glimpse of the scale involved. The headlines celebrated greater deterrence capacity and indigenous industry, but the figure also meant billions redirected to arms production rather than infrastructure or development. Cause and effect is visible here. Ambition to project more power translates into continued high allocations for defense, and those allocations reduce fiscal room for domestic programs. This trade-off is clearest in the Navy's most visible projects. Commissioning the INS Vikrant, India's first domestically built carrier, was rightly seen as a milestone in shipbuilding and national pride. But keeping such a platform active drains resources in ways not always appreciated outside naval circles. Crews must be trained and retained, spare parts purchased continually, docking facilities upgraded, and deployments fueled year after year. Unlike smaller systems, there is no way to scale these expenses down without undermining readiness. Every voyage eastward forces trade-offs at the central government level, choices between sustaining a blue water deployment and allocating more funding to healthcare, agriculture, or subsidies for households facing rising costs. The Andaman and Nicobar Command illustrates the same strain from another angle. Expanding these island bases has given India the capacity to monitor sea lanes and project power into Southeast Asia far more effectively than before. Yet building and maintaining this infrastructure is enormously expensive. Airfields must be expanded, supply flights run regularly, and personnel housed in isolated territory. It is a strategic asset that comes with recurring overheads, and those overheads eat into broader allocations. These are not one-time expenditures, but permanent commitments that accumulate over decades. Public opinion reflects the duality of pride and concern. Many Indians take satisfaction in seeing their country portrayed as a security partner in Asia, supplying missiles to the Philippines or working alongside Quad navies. The symbolism resonates strongly with a public aware of China's challenge. But alongside that pride runs anxiety about domestic stability. Families calculating monthly budgets feel sharpened inflation in food, fuel, and housing costs, while employment remains uncertain. Headlines about billion-dollar weapons contracts or forward deployments can therefore generate a quiet question. Could those resources have been directed instead to job programs, rural support, or cheaper essential goods? This divide in public discourse drives political risk. National prestige builds authority, but perceived misalignment with daily needs gives opposition parties ammunition to argue that global ambitions undermine local well-being. Government messaging has attempted to tie the two together. Leaders frame defense spending not as separate from domestic welfare, but as protection of the trade arteries that sustain India's economy. By this logic, securing the South China Sea is vital because such waters carry Indian commerce, energy supplies, and export routes. That message resonates at a macro level. Without secure sea lanes, domestic prosperity is indeed at risk. Yet the connection is harder to see for voters struggling with day-to-day costs, leading to skepticism. The arguments mitigate criticism, but do not erase doubt. Another consequence is slower progress in the long-term projects designed to reduce strategic dependency on China. Official initiatives in semiconductors, renewable energy, and advanced manufacturing all require heavy upfront funding. But with growing shares of budgets directed to military salaries, pensions, and procurement, timelines stretch and goals slip behind schedule. This produces a paradox difficult to ignore. India pours resources into countering Chinese power militarily, yet it remains dependent on Chinese supply chains because industrial policy is unable to accelerate fast enough. The Navy showcases strength, but the economic base that strength rests upon develops more slowly than intended. Policy debates within the government recognize the contradiction. Defense advocates emphasize the risks of falling behind China's fleet and argue that visible presence is essential to deter aggression. Economic ministries emphasize fiscal discipline, pointing out that without faster industrial growth, even the most advanced weapons become difficult to pay for. The resulting compromise is piecemeal. Programs are partially funded or delayed, agricultural and housing schemes move slowly, and promises get deferred as defense allocations remain high. This rolling pattern of compromise satisfies neither side fully, but keeps both moving forward enough to maintain appearances of balance. For the military itself, the domestic pressures mean the challenge of long-term sustainment. India has the capacity to build and deploy ships in the near term, a fact already visible in carrier operations, new destroyers entering service, and forward patrols running months at a time. Budget planners can keep these going over the course of a few years. But absent stronger growth, extending this momentum decades into the future becomes far harder. A large navy requires not just construction budgets, but ongoing commitments to fuel, spares, training, and logistics. Unless the economy expands rapidly enough to absorb these costs without sacrificing social stability, India risks stretching itself too thin. This fragile balance is reflected in domestic politics. Nationalist rhetoric frames sacrifices as necessary for security, invoking a vision of India asserting itself after decades of restraint. Pride in membership of groupings like the Quad, or in supplying advanced missiles abroad, provides political capital that makes high spending acceptable. Naval deployments become storytelling devices about India's rise, and for many citizens they do instill pride, but the tension does not vanish. Inflationary pressures, uneven job creation, and stalled development goals reinforce skepticism. India's leaders can point to growing strategic influence abroad, but they must manage the weight of public expectations at home. Ultimately, the question is tactical as much as economic. If India can finance sustained logistics networks and accelerate its industrial substitution programs, its forward posture could evolve into a durable presence. If not, deployments may be impressive but episodic, visible for months or years, yet vulnerable to economic shocks that pull back reach. The domestic foundation of strategy is therefore decisive, because ambition without sustainable resourcing risks leaving India exposed both abroad and at home. And this concern leads to another unavoidable question. Even while stretching to maintain ships at sea, can India credibly challenge China's dominance in the South China Sea? Or will its presence remain more symbolic than practical when directly compared on maritime terms? The hard limit of India's naval reach. India's eastward presence reflects ambition, but the decisive measure of power lies in sustaining operations under pressure. This is where the hard limit of India's naval reach becomes evident. The capabilities may look strong in snapshots, an aircraft carrier at sea, destroyers operating far from home, missile batteries delivered to partners, but the underlying constraints of numbers, bases, and logistics prevent India from challenging Beijing on equal terms in contested waters. Naval strength is not measured by moments of visibility. It rests on scale and endurance, and here India faces structural boundaries it cannot yet overcome. Fleet size draws the first clear contrast. India has invested significantly in modernizing its navy, commissioning advanced destroyers, frigates, and its first domestically produced carrier. Yet China's People's Liberation Army Navy dwarfs these efforts. The plan fields a far larger force of surface combatants, submarines, and auxiliary ships, and its shipbuilding industry continues to expand at a pace India cannot match. China's production lines deliver advanced destroyers and carriers at an almost routine rate, each equipped with modern aviation facilities and electronic systems. By comparison, New Delhi is introducing one carrier, while Beijing moves on to testing and deploying the next generation. In pure numbers and industrial capacity, the balance tilts heavily in China's favor. Raw scale alone does not decide every contest, but does determine who can stay at sea longer, project pressure further, and rotate forces without stretching too thin. Sustainment amplifies that imbalance. India's deployments into the South China Sea travel through narrow straits and across thousands of kilometers from bases in Mumbai, Chennai, or Visakhapatnam. Once inside contested waters, Indian ships are far from reliable dockyards, supply hubs, and air support. Their time on station is measured in weeks or months before the cumulative strain of distance forces a return to port. Every voyage requires complex logistics planning, replenishment at sea, fresh water and food resupply, mechanical upkeep conducted far from home. China faces none of these challenges. Its navy operates in its own neighborhood, supported by coastal bases, hardened airfields, and network of fortified outposts on artificial islands. Each facility extends a plan's ability to rotate ships and sustain operations. The difference is stark. While India must think carefully about each deployment, Beijing has the foundation to keep ships operating indefinitely. The Andaman and Nicobar Command was designed to offset part of this problem. These islands allow India to watch over the Malacca Strait, maintain surveillance, and stage forward into Southeast Asia. New radar sites and bases there improve reach, but even with these developments, India lacks permanent access points deeper inside the South China Sea. Port calls in Vietnam, the Philippines, or Singapore provide temporary options, but they depend on political will and do not equate to guaranteed basing rights. Contrast this with China's extensive installations, airstrips, hangars, radar, and missile systems built directly into reclaimed reefs. These provide permanent support platforms at the heart of contested zones. Geography and infrastructure work in Beijing's favor, leaving India to rely on stopgap measures. Technical systems reflect another layer of limitation. India's aircraft carrier sails with a limited air wing, smaller and less advanced than the aviation groups supported by China's newest carriers, which employ catapult systems and longer-range fighters. The same holds in the underwater domain. India's submarine fleet, while growing, is modest compared to the variety and volume China deploys. Effective anti-submarine warfare requires a full network of listening devices, maritime patrol aircraft, and sonar arrays spread through contested waters. China has invested in such networks extensively. India has only begun to build them. These support systems matter because a Navy's true reach is not just about visible hulls, but about the sensors, aircraft, and protective layers that allow those ships to survive prolonged operations. An equally decisive factor comes from the unseen fleet, the auxiliaries of tankers, supply ships, and logistics craft that keep destroyers and carriers functional. India's auxiliary force is limited, stretched across multiple missions in the Indian Ocean and any deployments to the broader Pacific. Without the capacity to continually refuel, resupply, and maintain, its navy cannot sustain prolonged patrols in distant seas. China's auxiliary force, by contrast, has grown in proportion with its combat fleet. This allows planned vessels to remain on station with a level of persistence India cannot replicate. Military analysts often stress that without auxiliaries, surface combatants cannot maintain continuous forward operations. Here the imbalance is critical because it shapes how long Indian ships can truly stay at sea under contested conditions. These hard realities mean India's new presence must be understood within limits. Sending ships into the South China Sea signals intent and builds symbolic weight, but it does not create the capacity to impose sea control if conflict erupted. India can complicate China's calculus. It can raise risks for Beijing by appearing alongside partners or supplying systems that put pressure on Chinese deployments. But it cannot impose a blockade, deny access, or maintain large numbers of vessels in prolonged contest. The decisive factors remain logistics, basing, and numbers of auxiliaries, areas where China retains clear advantages. India's contributions raise the cost of Chinese actions, but they do not remove Beijing's operational freedom. This does not make India irrelevant. Symbolism itself matters in the maritime domain. Every deployment forces China's commanders to account for Indian involvement alongside American patrols and local navies. BrahMos sails to Manila introduce new strike risks Beijing must manage. Joint exercises with Australia, Japan, or Vietnam strengthen the perception that India is embedded in regional security arrangements. Even if India cannot dominate contested waters, its moves increase uncertainty for China and reassurance for Southeast Asian partners. That psychological and political effect, over time, is a form of influence. The dynamic is therefore dual. Real limitations constrain India's ability to fight a sustained campaign far from its shores, but real presence ensures that China cannot ignore it. Indian carriers and destroyers demonstrate capability, not permanence. Indian auxiliaries and bases show ambition, but not yet sufficiency. Symbolic deployments are not without consequence. They develop the skills, doctrines, and planning India will need if it hopes to operate further afield in the future. The experience itself, repeated year by year, strengthens India's navy even if today's balance overwhelmingly favors China. What emerges is a maritime role best described as bounded influence. India has advanced from a distant observer to a direct participant in regional security affairs, but its capacity still falls short of peer competition. It has forced Beijing to take it seriously and has reassured partners eager for alternatives, but the material ceiling remains obvious. The plan's infrastructure, size, and logistics give it dominance in its near seas. India is a factor in the equation, but not an equal. The conclusion is blunt but necessary. India matters. It modifies Chinese calculations. But it does so within a bound. India is a factor, not yet a peer competitor for sustained sea control. Recognition of this reality does not diminish the achievement of New Delhi's new posture. It clarifies the scale of progress still required. And it sets the stage for the larger question. If the cost of being recognized as a player is exposure to new risks, how long can India sustain its balance before pressures abroad and a home force sharper choices? India's foray into the South China Sea has brought real visibility, but remains bounded by limits. Its navy can demonstrate credible reach, yet the scale and infrastructure to sustain those missions still trail far behind China. The transfer of BrahMos missiles to Manila has already shifted Beijing's deterrence calculus, showing that India can affect outcomes even without matching fleets ship for ship. But alongside these moves, India's heavy reliance on Chinese supply chains and Russian oil underscores a persistent strategic squeeze. Strategic autonomy remains possible, but sustaining it is becoming more difficult as global blocs harden. If you want a deeper breakdown of the BrahMos capabilities or how logistics limit blue water operations, comment which one you want next.